Welcome to episode 2 of Reading to Mom. My name is Joe, the publisher at Historia Research Press in Chicago. As we introduced in episode 1, an author of one of our publications, Arcane Cage, is reading to his mother during the COVID-19 pandemic while both are self-quarantined hundreds of miles apart. So, as we warned you, this author fervently believes that this fantasy world that he's created actually existed in our world history. Rather than come to terms with that and accept the disbelief that others have for this place and time, he ascribes the lack of interest to a general decline in respect for the humanities. He then proceeds to cast aspersions at everyone imaginable, Silicon Sultans and Bitcoin barons, whoever that might be, 3 types of critics who reject his work, as well as anyone he apparently came into contact as an academic working on this delusional project. So for us, Historia Research Press, who work with him in other capacities, we like to think of the author as one of the fictional characters of the work. Not necessarily in the work, but of the work. So, like the fantastical characters and events that he ascribes to the Arcane Age, this historian of the Arcane Age is as much a fiction as they are. If you accept that this is something of a performance to draw his readers into his fantasy world, then we think it's possible to have a little sympathy for that bitter old scholar. In episode 2, he'll be reading chapter 1 of Arcane Cage. It is, well, as you'll soon hear, it makes no logical sense to introduce a work of fantasy in this way. So, without further ado, the author of Arcane Cage, reading to his mom. Hi, Mom. I'm happy that you enjoyed the preface to Arcane Cage in episode 1. I'm reading chapter 1 to you in this episode, episode 2. Actually, I recorded this several days ago, April 3rd, but it's taken my publisher a few days to produce the video. Just now being asked to record an introduction for you several days later. This might sound peculiar, but I really don't know what publishers do, and mine seems to do as little as possible. I work with this with the understanding that at any time I could get rid of my publisher. In fact, if I stopped writing, the publisher wouldn't exist at all. So truly the only fictional aspect of the work that I do is my publisher. And so that gives me solace, and I allow him to have as much time as he needs to produce the things that I write. Chapter 1 introduces you to the time and place or the setting of the historical narrative that I tell. It's actually modeled on an old historiographical approach developed by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America when he wished to introduce the New World to the Old World. What I've done here is run through a series of significant places or names that you will encounter throughout the book, beginning with Eurynome, a mountain, sort of, rather than a single peak. It has 101 spires as a crown. Existing in the domain, the place that encompasses 2 different peoples, the Provenance and the Lyman. Inside Eurynome is a fortress of the Provenance, the Empire for Liberty, called the Acropolis. And then it launches into a discussion of the 4 ages of world history, and in particular the preternatural age, the first age of human history, and the arcane age, which is the time in which I focus on. In the final part of the chapter then, it will move a little bit into the social world of the Provenance, the main civilization that I discuss, and specifically about the middle class that grew up around the use of arcane philosophy or the classical powers, what skeptics call magic during this period of time. Chapter 1. The outward and inward configuration of the domain. Near the southern end of the Orpian Mountains, Eurynome reached upward toward the sky, as if to drink the light of the heavens and return the known world to its original darkness. Eurynome boasted the highest peaks in the Orphean range. She stood without equal, the highest mountain in the entire domain. And yet scholars demur when dilettantes describe the colossal formation as merely a mountain, quote unquote. Over a 13 days' journey by foot around its base, Eurynome's 101 rocky spires align to form a C-shaped phalanx of well-hewn, precipitous bluffs that open at a vast fissure on her southernmost side. In this respect, Eurynome gave the appearance of a conic-shaped volcano that violently cast off her peak, including a fifth of her mass, on the sun-bleached cliffs. Footnote 1. Estimates of Eurynome's base diameter are found in Hermaeus Geographia, published in Alexandria around 3163 of the Metal Age. Geographia is one of the few extant works on the cartography of the Provenance that has survived the Metal Age. Note, citations utilize the 4 Ages calendar notation system. See the bibliography for a brief summary of citation dates. End footnote. The absence of a peak created a vast chasm at the center of her elevation, protected by impenetrable embankments on 3 sides. The opening consumed the light of the sun as it passed overhead at the acme of its path in the sky overhead, while Eurynome's grotesque shadows ruled over the surrounding lands to the west, north, and east for much of the day. In name as well as stature, her great heights and immense shadows gave substance to Eurynome's title and the arcane tongue, quote, our wandering ruler, close quote. While only a few igneous rocks accompanied the massive boulders and common stones strewn about the vast territory that she ruled, the uppermost spires of Eurynome possessed, quote, a black hue as if scorched in a tremendous blast, close quote, according to the earliest account in written history. A swirling cloud of mist and dust often lingered in the precipitous crater that veiled the basin and cast a pall over the interior of the craggy formation as a final testament to Eurynome's infernal origins. Had Eurynome fully formed with a single mountainous peak, its highest point may have touched the fiery lashes of the sun above, as the arcane commoner's lore once claimed. Footnote 2. Sophero, Fragment 19, published in Agrinio in the third epoch, second period of the preternatural age. Despite being out of print for many years and increasingly difficult to obtain inexpensively through antique book dealers, Helen Cat Manfrey's Ansela to the Arcane Philosophers, a complete translation of the fragments, published in Cambridge in 691 of the Golden Age, remains the most accessible English translation of the extant text from the preternatural and arcane ages. End quote, or end footnote. Understandably, the peoples governed by Eurynome's shadowy realm often attributed the whole of creation to her. Arcane lore suggests Eurynome was the last of the colossal sierras to rise from the ground of the domain. In this retelling, quote, the Titan revolted against the powerful mountain deity, close quote, who thrust skyward the entire range of the Orphean Mountains. In a grand refusal, quote unquote, to press further and further southward, drawing to an end the winding, lifeless spine of desolate mountain peaks stretching from the north. Eurynome made possible the running rivers, the tillable plains, the plentiful forests, and even the seas. All being to the arcane mind, quote, flowed out the gaping maw on her sun-bleached face, close quote. In another account, from a later but more trustworthy source, Eurynome itself first, quote, rose from chaos to give birth to all things, close quote. In a violent explosion, the likes of which no incantation by the mightiest wizards ever repeated, Eurynome discharged, quote, the astral tapestry and darkened ether, close quote, that chased the light from the depths of the sky. Her conflagration set the world in motion, quote, separating night from day in the domain, close quote. The recoil of the blast raised the Orphean Mountains to the north to form the backbone of the known world and the first children of Eurynome's cosmic birth, quote unquote. A verse. She thrust the land upward as if to transgress of the celestial sphere that surrounds all, to tear apart beings from their mute shadows. End of verse. To her south, the lowland rivers, plains, and forests spilled out from the gorge in Eurynome's underside, quote, giving life and death to the plants and creatures, close quote, of the known world. Footnote 3. Gillespie, The Creation, published in Naxos, the fourth epoch, third period of the preternatural age. The most comprehensive collection of preternatural age and Arcane Age mythologies translated into English is Bertha the Grass, The Arcane Myths, published in Chicago, 919 of the Golden Age, an 11th reprint. Scholars are indebted to Kevon for preserving the alternative narrative of Euronymie's gift of creation as recounted in the recovered arcane text, Wisdom of the Torod, published in Agrinio around the 11th epoch, 7th period of the Arcane Age. Once privy to only the few surviving members of his prestigious class of rangers from the time. End footnote. While both myths won favor among the peoples of the domain, one fact seemed to belie both stories of Euronymie's labor at the creation of the world. Volcanic activity no longer disturbed her massive crater. Instead, far beneath the tallest spires, a field of clastic and organic sedimentary rocks littered the expanse between the bluffs high above. Worn by winds and rains throughout countless ages, the smooth rocks that remained at the center of the basin rest motionless on a remarkably unbroken, easily passable, and seemingly petrified floor that extended as a horizontal plane at the bottom of the deep crater. Nearly a league in diameter, terra firma seemed to flow from the crater's crevice, down the steep formation and onto the earthen basin below. Although the fertile plain beneath her gaping maw escaped her dark lashes, the immediate territory spent much of the day and night shrouded in the shadows of the wandering ruler, quote-unquote. The image of rock, forest, plains, and waters emanating from Euronymie's countenance left few to ponder why peoples of the domain frequently attributed the origins of the world to her majesty. Footnote 4. The detailed survey and description of Eurynymie in the arcane world derived from Hermaiu's Geographia. Archaeologists long disputed the exact location of Eurynymie. Recent discoveries in the West appear to have put to rest those disagreements. If correct, Eurynymie's capacity to seize hold of the imagination has notably diminished in our modern minds, a fate befallen many wonders of the Arcane Age world. And footnote. Then as now, the name domain roughly translates in modern languages as the known world. Footnote 5. The seminal philologist Terry Colgan was the first to systematically investigate the roots of modern languages in arcane languages, such as Elvish and Dwarvish tongues, in his work, An Arcane Age Vocabulary, published in Oxford in 673 of the Golden Age. Whereas Colgan used a Creole or mixed origin language of the Middle Age to study arcane texts, I favor a more distant parent language of the Western intellectual tradition. The pre-Hellenic language used in this work, which bridges the late Arcane Age and Middle Age, better captures the meaning and the pronunciation of these dead languages. It also minimizes confusion caused by the many names that a single city or forest had in the numerous dialects of the arcane cultures. In a few exceptions, however, there is no clear translation for an arcane word into a modern term, as with many proper names of people or places, for instance, Sidra or Titios. In addition, one word may gain such currency that it is found in multiple cultures. The name Demen is one such word, taken from the Elvish and used in nearly all languages of the past. It has been passed down to us today in nearly the same form and meaning. In those cases, the original word is translated into its modern spelling or cognate. End footnote. Then as now, the name Demen roughly translates in modern languages as the known world. In the arcane times recounted on these pages, one must note the known world was indeed a far smaller sphere than our modern world's unmasked globe. The peoples of the domain visualized its space in terms of the length of time it took them to cross the immense territory. 1 league measured roughly the distance that a typical traveler on foot covered on flat terrain in an hour. The inhabitable land of the domain, in such measures, covered an estimated 640,007 square leagues, extending for over 523 leagues from the infertile tundra of the northern barrens to the ashen deserts of the southern boundary. The domain stretched for approximately 1,201 leagues from the eastern seashores to the furthest outposts of the vast territory explored in the west. Assuming a half-day for movement and a half-day for rest, the domain ostensibly could be traversed in a little more than 3 months. Footnote 6. Solar time, the most ancient invention, was divided into days, months, seasons, and years, just as it is today, although the arcane peoples used a 13-month lunar calendar. The main difference is the manner in which our distant ancestors and we moderns measure eons. Whereas the modern world measures durations of time in decades, centuries, and millenniums, a system derived from the 10 base numbers that originated from counting coins in merchant shops and industrial factories, the Arcanes used what they called the 3 logos, or logical primes, of life. The logos were 11-year, 13-year, and 17-year periods of time that measured meteorological, biological, and sociological cycles, respectively. To these they later added a 137-year logos to measure epochal time, a rough approximation of the modern long century. In the 7th epoch, around the 7th epoch and 5th period, the Arcane Age astronomer Nicaea the Alcyonian proposed 4 additional primes: the 1009-year prime, the Zilia or Chilia, to measure historical ages; the 1,575,011-year prime for geological eras of the domain; the 40,066,051-year prime to measure the life cycle of celestial beings; and the 14,634,138,889-year prime to measure all time or infinity. Her estimate for the age of the universe, a remarkably accurate estimate for the time. See Hermaeus, the Arcane Treatise, published in Alexandria around 3137 of the Metal Age. Hermaeus manuscript, rediscovered in the West and first published in Latin by Susanni Petrarca Catania in 4159 of the Metal Age, under the title Amalgast, recorded for posterity's benefit the profound contributions of Nicaea to the study of prime numbers and astronomy during the Arcane Age. The precise estimates of the domain's size and traversal derived from Hermaeus' Geographia, supplemented by the extant accounts of transmigration in the domain. End of footnote. In a certain way, such means to measure the domain proved to be nothing more than a cruel joke, quote unquote. In the words of one adventurer, from the comfortably inhabited capitals of the east to the sparsely populated outposts of the west, over 1,200 leagues away, the terrain presented a number of obstacles: rolling hills, violent rivers, unbridgeable ravines, and entangling forests. The bold pioneers who ventured westward led bee-strong carts heavily laden with the sundry baubles and broken dreams collected from their humbled youths or miscarriages into adulthood. In total, the journey from the oceanic shores of the eastern cities to Eurynome required, quote, approximately 151 to 181 days, close quote, during the hottest season of the year. And that's an accurate estimate only for the unlucky sots who did not perish in an assault by monstrous beasts or scheming brigands during the treacherous journey through the howling expanse of the domain. Footnote 7. Several travelogues from the era remain. My description of the territory and passage through the domain comes from Sidra's journal and official reports to the High Council of the Provenance near the end of the Arcane Age. Sidra's collection of manuscripts and daybooks, published at the Acropolis around the 11th epoch and 7th period of the Arcane Age, are introduced in more detail in Chapter 4. End footnote. On arrival, weary settlers reached a tectonic geology flowing from the south side Gashian Eurynome, producing a kind of passable road into the obdurate heart of the Titan. While making possible the ascent of peoples and carts, Eurynome welcomed only those whose inclinations and vitality conquered the steep slope that climbed into the mountain fortress. The carriageway snaked through her crags and nooks for 19 leagues, forcing judicious travelers to complete the final leg of their journey in over 5 days. As a final test, after months of laborious travel through the domain, more than a few imprudent mortals drove their beasts to the point of collapse, eager to ascend into the immortal corona of spires that reached to the sky above, only to disappear with carts of belongings over the high cliffs near the top, their destination darkly looming above. A fortress twice over. Protruding from the obscuring mist animating the mountain goddess's crown, the fortress Acropolis seemed to float between the sharp onyx-limbed cliffs of Eurynome like a span suspended across an abyss. The outpost defensive structures stretched for over 1/3 of a league on each of its 5 sides, occupying over 1/4 of the ground space in Eurynome's crown. Moreover, seemingly inspired by the natural gifts of manifold spires, The dwarven architects and engineers erected the outer walls of the Acropolis to serve as a second rampart that defied penetration on all but one side. The one entrance permitted access to the inner commons of the Acropolis through narrow and well-guarded gates that faced to the southeast. The calculated design forced enemies who transgressed your enemy's natural defenses to circumnavigate the Acropolis's walls, standing 31 cubits tall and about 1/3 as wide. Footnote 8. About 17 by 5 meters or 47 by 17 feet wide. End footnote. Advancing enemies typically wilted during the march beneath the deadly rain unleashed by the defenders' bows and crossbows. Footnote 9. For an artistic rendering of the Acropolis from the perspective of its foes, see the petroglyph of the same name by an anonymous orc. Acropolis, published in the Acropolis around 11th epoch, first period of the Arcane Age. End footnote. Advancing enemies typically wilted during the march beneath the deadly rain unleashed by the defenders' bows and crossbows. Exploiting the impenetrable precipices of your enemy's spire on three sides, the Acropolis possessed all of the bulwarks and amenities of a well-planned strategic military outpost, a vision erected from the adamantine mind of a dwarf. Duly named, quote, the city at the extremity, close quote. The castle edifice testified to the severity of life in a colonial fortification constructed by a vast empire that ruled much of the domain at the end of the Arcane Age. The peoples of the Provenance, quote, the Empire for Liberty, unquote, populated the garrison at the edge of arcane civilization. As one of the earliest cultures in our world's history, the archaeological and archival records remain scant and ambiguous. For many years, the leading modern historians dismissed provenantial history as the romantic fantasies of amateur mythologists and popular history buffs. The discipline produced such a wide variety of scholarship and specialization, or according to the most acerbic critics, novels and literature, that many professional historians disputed the very existence of the Provenance in our distant past. Indeed, only one consensus perhaps exists among historians of the Provenance. Quote, the peoples of the Provenance knew the domain, the known world. To understand the place, one must also understand its people. Both must be studied together. Unquote. Despite that kernel of accord, scholarship on the Provenance, divided into hundreds, maybe thousands of unrelated lines of inquiry, deploying all manner of technical terminology and fanciful idioms that led to far too many acrimonious debates. Footnote 10. Due largely to the paucity of primary sources, the uncertainties in academic circles about the origins and dominion of the Provenance invited numerous, often preposterous interpretations that provoked heated disputes and recriminations. After more than a century of scholarship following the professionalization of the historical profession, the field found itself in such disarray that many of the leading colleges and universities failed to retain any faculty specializing in the preternatural or arcane ages. For many decades, it's fair to say, only amateurs and hobbyists sustained interest in this subject. The quote comes from Herveson son Villecoquet, though the attribution may be apocryphal. The relatively recent and fortuitous discovery by the Commercial Academy for the Study of the Arcane Powers, LLC, of several antebellum archives in the present-day vicinity of what scholars now regard as the preternatural age sites of Eurynomy and Titios, has renewed interest in the study of the Provenance, as this work of history attests. End footnote. The fractiousness of scholarship aside, a few basic details about the Provenance stand out to the modern mind. The political boundaries and social world of the Provenance embraced the vast majority of the domain at the height of its power. The earliest evidence traces the empire to the city-states near the shores of the oceans to the east of the domain. For 100 heptadecades, footnote 11, the arcane peoples believed that sociological time progressed in 17-year increments. This measure of arcane time has been revived by arcane scholars as a more precise measure for the modern and vague notion of generations, quote unquote. Like proper names of cities and places, certain concepts of the arcane world are rendered into apparent language of the Western tradition. For 100 heptadecades, The Provenance extended its dominion over the ever-increasing expanse of the domain in the period of history that we now call the Arcane Age. Although a comprehensive history is beyond the scope of this narrative and its primary sources, let it suffice that the civilization of the Provenance reached its zenith near the time when the events of the late Arcane Age, retold in this work, took place. Footnote 12. A scholar would be remiss if he or she failed to express immense gratitude to the immortal Jean d'Ormesson for lending credibility to the study of the history of the Provenance. Gloire de l'Empire Provenanciel, The Glory of the Provenancial Empire, published in Paris in 719 of the Golden Age, stands out like a star in the darkest hours of scholarship on the Provenance and the Arcane Age. As the New York Times reviewer wrote at the time of publication, d'Ormesson delivered one of the most engrossing histories ever written, quote, and a pure pleasure, quote unquote, in a novel history published January 19th, 727 of the Golden Age in the New York Times. d'Ormesson's History of the Provenance remains as relevant and insightful today as at the time of its release. End footnote. With an imperial concept of the domain in mind, the people of the Provenance commonly regarded the territory beyond the limits of its political power and cultural influence as the limen. See Illustration 1. Illustration 1. Hermieu's Map of the Domain. Footnote 14. English reproduction. Hermieu's map held by the House of Arcane Wisdom in Gondishpur, Iran, is a marvel that every true historian of the Arcane Age should see in person at least once during his or her lifetime. While the curators do not allow digital reproductions of the cartography, scholars are allowed to sketch or graphically represent the basic features of the domain to further historical research. Any errors from, differences with, or amateurish caricatures of the original masterpiece are my own. And Illustration 1. The best cartography available from this period divides the limen into 4 cardinal regions surrounding the Provenance. The East Limen began at the shores of the tempestuous ocean. The great waters that frustrated and swallowed every naval adventurer who dared to penetrate its secrets during the Arcane Age. To the north, the lifeless tundra extended for at least 311 leagues. No explorer made it further than 23 days into the Barrens before his or her crew revolted in fits of despair and privation. At the South Limen, the gulfs of the tempestuous ocean gave way to hot and blinding sands that limited the availability of new lands and scotched the grasping advance of merchants and their combative mercenaries. Confined by the topography of the domain on 3 sides, the Provenance pushed its borders ever westward for over a millennium, bringing the illimitable resources of the Ferris Mountains, the fertile fields of the Central Plains, and the inhospitable climate of the Golden Dunes under its mercantile and bureaucratic control. Footnote 13. Hermieu's late successor at the library in Alexandria, Theonia, cites an extraordinary number of arcane maps and land surveyors' reports in a fragment from her Bibliography of Provenantial Cartography, published in Alexandria in 3407 of the Middle Age, most of which has been lost to posterity. The few remaining pages of her Cartographical History of the Provenance, published in Alexandria in 3413 of the Middle Age, offers a unique visual glimpse into the territorial expansion of the Provenance. The earliest modern account of her contributions to the preservation of arcane texts is found in Hon Gédon, Theonia, The History of a Lady Torn to Pieces, by the First Estate of Rome, published in London, 503 of the Golden Age. Confined by the topography of the domain on 3 sides, the Provenance pushed its borders ever westward for over a millennium, bringing the illimitable resources of the Ferris Mountains, the fertile fields of the Central Plains, and the inhospitable climate of the Golden Dunes under its mercantile and bureaucratic control. Agrinio of the Arokthoi, or Sacred Forest, served as the final waypoint before the empire pressed its limits to the mountain fortress at Eurynome. For the Provenance, the only barriers to its westward expansion were the will of its people, the stock of its resources, the diurnal dread for magical beasts, and, of course, the numerous cultures that already made their homes in the West Limen. Our narrative herein begins at a time when Eurynome and the Acropolis marked the furthest advance of the Provenance into the West Limen. For a period that lasted longer than 2 epochal primes, 277 years, or 16.3 heptadecades, the Provenance failed to push beyond its mountain outpost on the West Lyman. In fact, the Acropolis only gradually earned its reputation as, quote, the city at the extremity, unquote, after several generations tarried on the borders of the brutish and intractable wilderness to its west. Footnote 15. The first provenantial settlers at the site of the Acropolis named their homestead New Titios, as a testament to their goal of recovering the pre-Arcane Age city of Titios, rumored to have been located in Eurynymes's crown. After the hope to recover Titios waned and the threat of the Lyman waxed, residents and visitors alike came to consider the outpost the limits of provenantial jurisdiction. End footnote. Guided only by the visual aid of maps, the archives suggest that the domain divided territorially into two, the Provenance and the Lyman. When examined with more subtlety, however, the cartographic boundaries of the Provenance and the Lyman mask the ceaseless exchange of cultural practices and economic wares along the border of the two worlds. More than a millennium of political intrigue, as well as social conflict, colored the manifest destiny, quote-unquote, of the Provenance as its dominion spread from the east coast to envelop the continent. In fact, while the Provenance may have swallowed the Lyman with its citizens and their westward advance, the redrawn boundaries failed to consider how the Provenance became pregnant with the Lyman following each new conquest. For this reason, a brief history of the social world of the Provenance and the character of its people will aid readers who begin this story unfamiliar with our most fantastic age. Quote, in world history, close quote, the historian Mad Myths proclaimed, quote continues, there have been 4 great ages, preternatural, arcane, metal, and golden, close quote. Footnote 16. Mad Myths, Lectures on Provenantial Jurisprudence, published at Oxford in 733 of the Golden Age, a reprint of lectures first delivered in Glasgow in 509 of the Golden Age. End footnote. In world history, the historian Mad Myths proclaimed, there have been 4 great ages, preternatural, arcane, metal, and golden. As students of history know, many of our modern civilizations trace their origins to the preternatural age, the obscure age that gave rise to 7 godheads who established the 7 original city-states of the domain, a prehistorical time from which no written records remain to account for the origin of the godheads. The age remains cloaked in mystery and conjecture. The art of writing itself begins only after the founding of the 7 cities, an invention of the theistic bureaucracies that extended the godhead's control into every facet of the city's social worlds. The sprawling bureaucracies of the preternatural age godheads, including their written languages for record-keeping, unfolded as a byproduct of population growth and agricultural intensification. The fecundity of the land matched the fertility of the people, producing new and more plentiful crops that required increasingly detailed systems of notation to account for the wealth accruing to the godheads. Beyond these generalities, the archaeological evidence proves scant, leaving unanswered why the domain witnessed the sudden explosion in architectural advancements and agricultural engineering that corresponds to the foundations of the 7 cities of the godheads. Footnote 17. For agricultural intensification and its dynamic influence on population growth and technological invention during the Arcane Age, see the work of economist Sert Bouproust, The Conditions of Arcane Age Agricultural Growth, published in New York in 727 of the Golden Age. To the modern reader, the preternatural age largely remains an inaccessible period in world history, shrouded in a cloud of unknowing, inscrutable for all but those capable of suspending disbelief. What is known is that the godheads ruled the 7 cities with despotic authority. Anthropologists often refer to the state, religion, and economy as the tripod that supports the formation of societies. In the preternatural age, one may say, the cities of the godheads united the 3 legs into a single stump. Each godhead assumed total command of the city, issuing a statement of principles that directed the labors of their subjects and dictated the indulgences afforded for their subject laborers' predilections. Although the statements established vastly different moral and legal codes in the 7 cities, all 7 lawgivers uniformly demanded fealty from the subjects who fell under the city's jurisdiction. In addition, all 7 statements rewarded the godheads with the annual surpluses of their subjects' labors. These 2 commandments, paramount to all other laws in the city-states, effectively bound worship and wealth to the godheads. Footnote 18. With the exception of fealty and tithing to the godheads, these codes of conduct continued to provide a foundation for the ethical and social behavior of all peoples in the domain during the Arcane Age. The persistence of the several statement of principles into the Arcane Age will be explored in later chapters. End footnote. In this respect, the political order of the preternatural age introduced the first main division of political and social order, that of the ruler and the ruled, the nobles and the commoners, the few and the many, or the state and the people, as we know it today. For many centuries, scholars judged the irreconcilable conflict between the state and the people as the essential social struggle that defined the history of the domain. With a tiny distinction between those who controlled and those who served the instruments of government, most scholars of the domain worked in the tradition of mad myths, grand narrative, quote-unquote, that emphasized political strife and civic constitutions as the drivers of historical progress. According to one disciple, history unfolds like an inevitable march to liberty, spurred by an absolute spirit, quote-unquote, that animated every great popular revolution that swept inequality and slavery from the world stage. Quote, the history of the known world, domain in the original, is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom, claimed Igor Lej, a progress whose development is according to the necessity of its nature. End of quote. In the patient passage of time from the preternatural age to the golden age, our world has become more conscious of freedom, our politics more civilized, our work more bountiful, and the will of the people more inviolable. The enlightenment, quote-unquote, of the absolute spirit determines world history like the iron fist of a despot. Footnote 19. Igor Lej, Lectures on the Philosophy of Arcane History, published in Berlin, 577 of the Golden Age. And the quote is from page 19. Consonant with his overweening nature, Igor Lej argued that 3 deadly conflicts stand as the turning points between the 4 great ages of myths world history. See illustration 2. Illustration 2. The 4 ages of world history. A timeline of significant events for the study of arcane philosophy. The 4 ages of world history are 1. The preternatural age, beginning with writing and ending in the Glorious Revolution. The 2nd, Arcane Age, beginning at the Glorious Revolution and ending at the First Great War. The 3rd, Metal Age, beginning at the First Great War and ending at the Second Great War. And our current era, the Golden Age, beginning with the Second Great War. End of illustration 2. In the preternatural age, the Godhead's control of state power and the nobles' administration of the bureaucracy taught the people law, morality, and civility. In this sense, the Godhead city-states proved to be necessary evils to instill a sense of public good among the commoners. Despotic benevolence notwithstanding, Lej contends, the preternatural age divinities remain the natural enemies of the people's liberties. The first of the domain's 3 deadly conflicts, the Glorious Revolution, witnessed the commoners' inevitable revolt to oppose the Godheads, bringing the preternatural age to a close. Footnote 20. Subsequently, 2 more deadly conflicts, the 2 Great Wars, represent the 2 other portentous events in the progress of liberty and the triumph of the absolute spirit over the worship of supernatural states. Lej's grand narrative concludes, quote, the history of the world is the discipline of the uncontrollable natural will, bringing it into obedience to a universal principle and conferring subjective freedom. The preternatural world knew only that one is free. The arcane world that some are free. The metal world that the propertied are free. The golden world knows that all are free. The first political form, therefore, which we observe in history is despotism, the second democracy, the third timocracy, the fourth plutocracy. Close quote. From Lej, Lectures, page 109. The first of the domain's 3 deadly conflicts, the Glorious Revolution, witnessed the commoners' inevitable revolt to depose the Godheads, bringing the preternatural age to a close. In sum, preternatural age slavery proved to be no more repressive than the chains of a self-incurred tutelage that the commoners cast off with mind, time, and more than a little egoistic puffery. Footnote 21. Elumen Tank. What is Arcane Philosophy? Published in Mycenae around 1783 in the Metal Age. Informed Lege's arguments and still stands as an influential Metal Age treatise on the origins of the Glorious Revolution. As Lege notes in his lectures, Tonks' understanding of arcane philosophy eliminates the need to understand the social struggles and political conflicts of the preternatural age. The people were unfree only because each individual alone lacked the will to throw off self-tutelage. Thus we see the true meaning of Tonks' pithy summary for the spirit of arcane philosophy. Dare to care. From Lege, Lectures, page 463. End of footnote. Between the civil upheavals of the Glorious Revolution and the First Great War, the history of the Provenance records the most important advances in liberty during the Arcane Age. Foremost, the sovereignty of the people triumphed in the adoption of the revolutionary constitution that placed limitations on the power of the state and established the self-rule of the common stock. Equally significant in recognition of certain self-evident truths, the socio-economic order of the Provenance unchained commoners from their customary agricultural peonage under control of the state regime, resulting in innovations that added to an endless variety of economic opportunities for many generations. Third, to discourage the long-standing effrontery of the nobility, the cultural values of the province encouraged its citizens to regard virtuous character as the bedrock of social order. Behind the politics, then, stood a social world unlike any other in world history. While the March of Freedom lightens the burden on popular historians' imaginations, footnote 22, our commercial booksellers' virtual shelves remain filled with electronic books that tell us that our founding fathers secured our freedoms in the distant past, and duty demands that posterity simply preserve the gift of freedom evermore. Despite numerous publications by critical theorists, the sad commentary is that most school children continue to learn from textbooks that deploy the grand narrative of myths, legs, and Tonks' ineluctable world historical march to freedom. Thus, the Glorious Revolution and the First Great War are the bookends to the Arcane Age in the popular imagination, despite how often historians have revised or debunked the consensus in traditional historical circles. End footnote. Behind the politics, then, stood a social world unlike any other in world history. While the March of Freedom lightens the burden on popular historians' imagination, the past was much more like the societal conflict that the long-discredited radicals in the Interpolis Commoner Association, ICA, once described. Footnote 23. The Interpolis Commoners Association formed shortly before the First Great War. Interpolis refers to an alliance among commoners from the different cities of the Domain. Today, the term international has similar currency. The organization's Commoners Manifesto, published in Naxos in the 12th epoch of the Arcane Age, captures the most complete statement of the association's social and economic theory. Nearly all written records of the ICA disappeared in the pogroms of reckoning, quote-unquote, that concluded the First Great War. For many years, old wives' tales and the insane scribblings of so-called madmen and anarchists offer the only record of the group's once formidable existence. The description of the three interests, quote-unquote, that follows is largely taken from recently uncovered, as yet unpublished, counter-revolutionary pamphlets. See Records for the Panoptes Conference of the Interpolis Commoners Association, published in Panoptes in the 11th epoch and 7th period of the Arcane Age. The translation from the original is my own. End of footnote. According to works recovered from the once-lost ICA papers, three interests influenced the political events and shaped the social conditions of the late preternatural age: the classical powers, the mechanic arts, and the mercantile cartels. The classical powers, also known as arcane philosophy, referred to the class of individuals who possessed magical abilities for combat arts and spellcasting. The mechanic arts encompassed the handicraft and skilled artisans who created and forged amazing weapons, wands, scrolls, and assorted talismans during a millennium of invention that continues to excite the inquisitive modern imagination. Lastly, the mercantile cartels represented the traders and proprietors who traveled far and near in the Domain to stimulate the exchange of goods, reagents, artifacts, and other assorted bounty. Together, the three separate interests forged an interlocking network that stimulated the principal social and economic activities of the arcane world: adventuring, crafting, and trading. Notably, these three interests first took shape during the preternatural age to serve the bureaucratic needs of the 7 cities of the godheads. Each city organized its interest into guilds that regulated and bridled the persons who engaged in the new economic activity that followed the discovery of the classical powers, or magic, as modern skeptics prefer. Whichever terminology is employed, the middling rank of arcane philosophers, artisans, and proprietors emerged in the social order to complement the two original castes formed from the deistic state, the nobility and the peons who toiled on the land. Under the watchful eye of bureaucrats and mercenaries, the middling ranks initially enhanced the political power marshaled in subservience to the godheads, ensconced in their municipal palaces. Eventually, though, the middling rank introduced turmoil into the superficial tranquility of the despotic cities. In time, the multiplicity of interests and the economic wealth of the middling rank divided the allegiances of nobles, guilds, and commoners, such that the people in every city served their various social interests more stridently than they served the godhead of their respective metropolis. At the forefront of the anti-deistic factionalism, the arcane philosophers grew in both personal stature and material force to the point that the most powerful champions and spellcasters openly defied the will of the godheads. The arcanists, quote, when collective wisdom eventually dared, close quote, and footnote 24. The ICA papers do not elaborate on this point. See Records for the Panoptes Conference, Day 2, end footnote. The arcanists, quote, when collective wisdom eventually dared, close quote, deposed the godheads at the end of the preternatural age, lending their collective name to the epics and the lore of a new historical era, the Arcane Age, the setting for our narrative. For now, a concise introduction will acquaint new students with the nature of the classical powers, or arcane philosophies, of the antebellum domain. Although the exact nature and abilities of the classical powers were lost to posterity after the First Great War, scholars of the Arcane Age have been able to piece together several general facts from the extant fragments of the early ages. First, a small percentage of the population in the domain, no more than 20% by the most liberal estimates, possess the ability to call forth primal forces of the universe with their minds and bodies. Some cast powerful spells of lightning and fire. Some mastered the forms of wildlife. Others learned great feats of combat, while still others channeled therapeutic spirits to heal the dying and diseased. In a time when many held the occupation of farmer or mercenary, the fortunate few touched by the gift of arcane wisdom quickly found far greater opportunities and earned a much better lot than the laity of the domain. In time, those who commanded the classical powers adopted traditions and codes of conduct that made them into the most prestigious interests of the domain. Footnote 25. Inasmuch as our main narrative chronicles events largely shaped by a small band of adepts in the classical powers, ample opportunities will present themselves to thoroughly inform the modern reader with what is now known about the intricacies of arcana. End of footnote. Aside from the personal abilities to manipulate the forces of nature with their wills or whatnot, the masters of the classical powers honed skills to imbue common objects and weapons with magical effects that aided them in battle and diplomacy. The combat masters in the mountain city of Paline first learned to craft magical weaponry. Fighters highly regarded the benefits in combat from magical enhancements to weapons, so much so that they required all of their novices to apprentice in the arts of the weapon and armorsmith, in addition to the mysteries of their classical powers. Initially, the other practitioners of the classical powers imitated this example, requiring their own apprentices to master all aspects of their classical powers, including the design of equipment and the transmutation of reagents. In time, though, the practice proved too onerous for many students who needed many precious hours to study the crucial arcana of their classical calling. Additionally, many prominent students who failed to master basic feats of the classical powers discovered that they possessed an extraordinary facility to craft advanced equipment, weaponry, and vials, often more artfully than masters of the classical powers. As a consequence, quote, a second social division of labor produced the mechanic arts, close quote, crafts and trades which supplied the classical powers with needed equipment and magical items. Footnote 26. On this point, the ICA's Commoners Manifesto is much less clear. The document fails to define what exactly constitutes a social division of labor, quote unquote. In our so-called golden age, all persons possess the right to vote despite tremendous differences in wealth, while our international system of commerce assures us that all people share in the same station as consumers and the middle class. Modern life, our consumer society, transcends whatever social divisions of labor once existed to the point of obscuring what was once regarded as a clear and distinct idea. Or perhaps our hubris comforts us with the belief that that is so. End of the footnote. As a consequence, quote, a second social division of labor produced the mechanic arts, close quote, crafts and trades which supplied the classical powers with needed equipment and magical items. Crafting weapons to be imbued with magic frequently required rare minerals or reagents, as well as the artistry to tune, quote unquote, the components precisely for a specific type of enhancement. For this reason, the middling ranks of the mechanic arts and the classical powers shared fortunes throughout the second age of the Dement. More importantly, since many craftsmen spent years studying alongside acolytes in the classical powers, the two interests, quote unquote, identified strongly with each other. Persons engaged in the two separate interests mutually aided each other in this period. By the end of the Arcane Age, per the ICA, advancements in the mechanic arts, quote, made the second great interest the equal of the classical powers and formidable in its own right, close quote. The division of labor between the classical powers and the mechanic arts increased the movement of peoples and objects between the cities of the Provenance. The geographic mobility and economic exchange spawned networks of commerce that resulted in a third major division of social labor, the mercantile cartels. In point of fact, the mercantile cartels actually trace their origins to the nobles who acted as the tithe collectors of the godheads in the preternatural age. At that time, there were two main suborders, the mercenaries and the merchants. Footnote 27. In the preternatural origin of the term, before the classical powers, mercenaries were known strictly for their willingness to commit an atrocity, quote, in exchange for a single gold coin, close quote. In fact, the bureaucracy of the godheads invented coinage to better control the city's mercenaries. When the mercenaries began to exchange pillage for gold nuggets and to gamble away their pillage with each other, the city-states began the practice of coining gold with exact weights and images of the godheads to control exchange values. If a mercenary gained too many coins in the eyes of the godhead, the bureaucratic cronies simply declared the wealth counterfeit and seized what the godhead willed. End of footnote. At that time, there were two main suborders, the mercenaries and the merchants. In this respect, the mercantile cartels were older than the classical powers and the mechanic arts, but the balance of power shifted at the end of the preternatural age, changing the character of the interests. In the long era before the advent of the classical powers, when the godheads ruled unchallenged, the mercenaries thrived among the commercial class. Known as the Hekatomononker, the 101-handed one, a unit of 50 combatants plus one one-armed purse-bearer, quote-unquote, footnote 28. The one-armed purse-bearer is the antecedent of the modern merchant. At this time, however, the merchant was little more than a state treasurer. By law, the godheads required the purse-bearers to have one arm chopped off, so that the coin collectors never had a free hand, so to speak, to steal from the godheads' coffers. See Vigras, Arcane Myths, page 271. End of footnote. Known as the Hekatomononker, the, quote, 101-handed one, unquote, a unit of 50 combatants plus one one-armed purse-bearer, quote unquote, the mercantile cartels enforced the city's statement of principles, collected tithes for the state, and carried the standard of the godhead between the cities. During the Arcane Age, when a distributed system of commerce between members of the mechanic arts and classical powers flourished between the cities of the Provenance, the purse-bearers became the elites of the mercantile cartels due to their knowledge of writing, basic record-keeping, and accounting ledgers. Thus, as the wealth and trade between the classical powers and the mechanic arts grew, so too did the wealth and importance of the mercantile cartels. For reasons attributable to their growing interdependency, among other reasons, the three interests collectively became known as the middling rank, and as the merchants characterized it, three sides of the same coin. Footnote 29. A bit of mercantile humor, indicating that all three interests were united by the base desire for worldly wealth. End footnote. For reasons attributable to their growing interdependency among other reasons, the three interests collectively became known as the middling rank, quote unquote, and as the merchants characterized it, quote, three sides of the same coin, close quote. The Interpolis Commoners Association called it the inner liman, quote unquote, the self-interest, the lust for gold, the desire for stature that seduced individuals to stray from the public good of the Provenance. The notion of an inner liman remains an important intervention in the spatial and social imagery of the Arcane Age, it must be noted. In one respect, it exposes how dubious it is for historians to draw a clear line between the Provenance and the liman using the boundaries on a map of the domain. In a second respect, the lines on a map persisted long after the lines among the character of the people ceased to exist. One might say, in other words, the Provenance embraced both the territory and the character of the people of the liman, just as the liman absorbed the territorial expansion of the Provenance. These final considerations introduce one further complication that undermines any formal distinction between the Provenance and the liman in the arcane history of the domain. No fortification existed at the threshold of the West Liman for any length of time, before some of its citizens eventually adopted the affectations of the cultures that vexed the Provenance and resisted the dominion of its councils. In this respect, the Acropolis truly was the city at the extremity, quote unquote, not entirely on one side or the other of the border arbitrarily drawn between the Provenance and the liman. Lastly, it may be noted that many people in the domain possessed long-held traditions and customs that did not adhere entirely to the proclamations and summons of the provenantial councils. Dwarves, elves, gnomes, orcs, goblins, gnolls, and a wide assortment of other cultures. Footnote 30. Scholars and laypersons alike once used the antiquated and inexact term of race to describe the different peoples of the domain, as if each people represented a different tribe, genus, or species in the taxonomy of the hominid family. Such prejudices have long since been refuted by more enlightened scholarship. Following the humanist principles advocated by the anthropologist Franz Z. Boas, the past and present peoples of the domain are now differentiated by their linguistic, historical, sociological, and archaeological qualities. In this vein, our work follows her convention that applies the broad term culture to distinguish the peoples of the domain. The literature, of course, has grown exponentially in recent decades, but the reader may enjoy her seminal works, including The Mind of Arcane Man, published in New York in 661 of the Golden Age, or Race, Language, and Culture in the Arcane Age, published in Chicago, 691 of the Golden Age. End footnote. Dwarves, elves, gnomes, orcs, goblins, gnolls, and a wide assortment of other cultures populated the Provenance and the West Alignment. Events recounted in this work will afford ample time to discuss the diverse peoples of the domain, their origins and their allegiances, their defiance of the Provenance. For now, let me say, these cultures oftentimes found their collective interests divided by the boundary between the Provenance and the liman. And no bond proved stronger or more durable at the end of the Arcane Age than the bond of language and culture among the peoples of the domain. Footnote 31. Plenty of myths and fairy tales exist to give the reader more than a vague sense of the cultural character of such peoples like dwarves, elves, orcs, and goblins. The modern personifications and caricatures provide a suitable point of entry into our history during the closing era of the Arcane Age. The attentive reader, however, must learn to cut through such preconceptions. If she or he hopes to grasp with facts and realism, how our ancestors lived in a more magical world, and perhaps no less modern time than our own. And this concludes Chapter 1 of Arcane Cage.